Hello, and welcome to the show, Voting for Change. My name is Michael Prince, and I'm one of your hosts, joined today by Terry Dance-Bennick. Thank you for joining us. Okay. And our very special guest today, the Honourable Rob Fleming, Minister of Education and MLA for Victoria Swan Lake. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great, great. I wanted to start off by talking about some of your own thoughts about electoral reform. I know effective representation has been a real interest of yours, whether it's been at the local government level and certainly at the provincial level. So maybe we could begin, but tell us a bit about why electoral reform is so near and dear to your heart and why you think it's so important.
Well, I think the most important thing is that we're talking about a real live exercise here. This is a generational opportunity to change the way we vote and to include more citizens of British Columbia in their democracy. I'm in my fourth term in the Legislative Assembly, and we've seen a lot of shifts, and generally the trend line is downwards in terms of overall voter turnout. We know the experience around the world under proportional representation voting systems in Western European countries and Scandinavian countries is much, much higher turnout, particularly among young people, and therefore more enfranchisement, more engagement with democracy. We've got that opportunity right now that our government has put before the people of British Columbia. It's their choice, of course, on their voting system. And I encourage people to study and examine it and participate, because I think we have to worry about declining engagement in British Columbia. We have to look at how we can invigorate and improve our democracy, and that opportunity is before people today.
Right. Okay. Well, you've touched on a couple of things our show's examined before, and certainly during this month and as the vote's getting closer. What does it mean for the role of the local representative? People have a lot of questions about how might this change the role of my MLA or MLAs, my access to them, and whether my voice is effectively heard in whatever option or choice, if there was to be a change in the voting system.
Well, I think in the options that are on offer, what British Columbians will get is retaining the local representation factor and having constituency representation, but they will also get a second vote for the party that they favor. And, you know, I have often encountered a lot of voters who say, I'd like to vote for you, and I think you do a good job as an MLA, but I don't support your party, and my vote counts towards the overall tally. You know, they know how forming a government works under first past the post. And so there's an awful lot of quote-unquote strategic, or what some people would call wasted votes in our electoral system. The great thing about pro-rep is you get the strengths of both systems. You retain the local representation and that type of democracy, and you get additional democracy in terms of a second vote for where your values align and what kind of government you'd like to see at the end of the voting period.
Is it be confusing, you think, for people to have, say, two MLAs for one constituency, or two MLAs of two different parties? Or these are the kind of questions that we're hearing when people are thinking about what the implications may be for the local constituency or the local representation.
I don't think it would be, and I mean, I think New Zealand is a great comparator to British Columbia, not only because it has almost the same size population, 4.5 million people, and New Zealand formerly had first past the post for a long, long time. They brought in a referendum and changed their voting system to something like what we're proposing here in British Columbia, and they never looked back. Voters immediately understood the strengths of the new voting system, embraced it, and then reaffirmed it 2 elections later when they were asked to vote on it again. So I think, you know, I think that we would expect the exact same thing here in British Columbia, where voters are quite literate. We're just having fewer and fewer voters turn out, and I think that's a problem, and I think that's why we ought to go in the same direction that New Zealand did in their voting.
Great. Thanks. Rob, what would be the implication of a pro-rep system on the number and the size of electoral districts, and would rural areas be adequately represented in the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, the size of the parliament would be basically the same. And that's included in the referendum information that people will have before them. But I think actually what you will see is a better balance between rural and urban. I think the rural voice will be strengthened. A lot of rural constituencies feel completely shut out of government when government changes, based on whether they voted with the majority party or not. We have entire regions that are, you know, historically controlled, if that's the right word, by one party, where they generally win all of the seats. One thinks of the Okanagan, for example, or even parts of northern British Columbia, the northeast. And so there, again, we get back to this phenomenon of people thinking their vote is wasted, and therefore they don't even bother. There's a lot of other viable votes that they could cast under a better system, and I think, you know, we have to worry about rural and urban British Columbia not being able to communicate with one another effectively. Very different parts of of the same province, the same economy. We need to have intelligent conversations on energy policy, resource policy, all those kinds of things. I think proportional representation encourages encourages different parties, different perspectives, different regions to be able to work together in a government, and I think that's going to be make for a stronger British Columbia.
Right. Good. In the current arrangement now between the NDP and the Greens, would that be an example of the kind of government we could expect under a pro-rep system? And what have you learned personally from that form of cooperation?
I think that could be one outcome, but you know, I think we would be able to look forward to stable governments of all kinds, and you know, more pluralism in British Columbia. You know, what you're seeing in a number of countries, by the way, the most prosperous countries in the world with the highest GDP and you know, low unemployment rates and high educational attainment rates, and I'm talking, you know, about some Western European countries and Scandinavian countries that have gone to proportional representation. You see solid governments where you don't have the polarized swings in their politics. You have a stronger national consensus in some of those places, and I think that's what British Columbians are looking for. I often hear, you know, it's, you know, the two main parties throwing mud at each other in British Columbia, and you know, sometimes that changes. We used to have something called social credit. Now we have BC Liberals. People are tired of that. They want a much more intelligent debate, because they know that as a province we have difficult decisions that we have to make, and we have to have a vision and proceed and try and build something a lot more consensus-based than the party that gets 40% of the votes having 100% of the power. And that's the outcome we've had way too many times throughout the history of British Columbia. And it's a problem now that we see in Ontario with Doug Ford. There's 60% of people that didn't vote for that vision, and it's swinging to a fairly far-right government. And you know, that could happen if we don't seize this opportunity to change our voting system here in British Columbia. I think what people want is good compromises, the ability to work across party lines, and have a much more functioning parliamentary democracy.
Well, you've touched on one of the questions I was going to ask about, the current political tone that we see south of the border in the United States, certainly, and you mentioned Doug Ford, the recent elected premier in Ontario, sort of a shrill tone of politics, a more polarized tone of politics. This province has not been immune to that over our political history as well, but you're suggesting that perhaps PR could lead to a shift or newer opportunities, create a different kind of tone in politics here in our province. Could you just say a little bit more about that, as to how that might happen, and the direction that might take us?
I think you would have a slightly different composition in the Parliament. I think you'd probably see the diversity of British Columbia better reflected in the legislature through proportional representation, and I think you would see the opportunity for stable governments to emerge that have more than one party within them. And that would represent a lot more than just 40% of the votes that have rewarded majority governments that have had 100% of the power, as I said earlier. So that to me is positive. On a day-to-day basis in the legislature, one of the things that has struck me in the past is that we don't have the ability to work across the aisle or across party lines in for example, jointly sponsoring legislation. We have not traditionally had a very robust committee system because the government can shut that down. So when you have more parties, more perspectives and voices, and you know, the ability to form a stable government based on more than just one perspective, I think you're going to you know, breathe some life back into our parliamentary institutions and make them much more responsive. And that's what this is about. Proportional representation, to me, represents an historic opportunity to put people at the center of politics in BC.
Yeah. You've heard this concern before, and again, I think we need to raise it, the issue of fringe parties. I mean, those on the no side in particular, point to various countries, some in Western European countries that you've mentioned, about the rise of the alternative right or the far right, or even on the far left, but single issue groups or so-called far right, far left fringe parties, almost a concern that PR will encourage the emergence of those or reward those in our own political system. You've been around for a while. What are your thoughts on that concern that's being raised by some?
Well, I think there's a lot of fear mongering and overstatement on that. Actually, what you're seeing in Western Europe right now is the emergence of grand coalitions between major parties of the center right and the center left. It's the center that is holding strong in Germany and other West European countries, and they face a migrant crisis and all kinds of issues that are not an issue in North America today. But I think maybe where the BC Liberals are most scared or showing naked self-interest, if I can put it that way, is that they have had a very difficult job holding their coalition together. They have people that orient towards center of the road federal Liberals all the way to quite hard right conservatives, and that has created a lot of fractures. And you know, if there's two parties to emerge from that one party, and they would both have strong representation in the legislature, they may come together, or they may combine in the center with my party, the New Democrats. Who knows? It's not. The point, though, I think, is really about the voter, and I think the voter gets to decide whether they think they can improve upon the voting system with some of the flaws. And the biggest one is, again, we over-reward parties with 100% of the power, right, and shut out voices in entire regions of the province from the governing process. And if you want to end that, and you want to improve that, and you want your vote to have more power, in a sense, basically have the citizen have exercised more responsiveness from politicians by making their vote count for more, then I think people should look at proportional representation and vote accordingly.
Right.
And there is a 5% threshold as well.
There, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that's important, and I think it's also important that voters should look at this opportunity and see if they want to try it out, as New Zealanders did, and then see if they want to keep it in a couple of elections' time. You know, I think I have a lot of trust in independent electoral officer and a boundaries commissioner to get whatever system British Columbians might choose right, to keep politicians away from that. We don't want to have back rooms. We want to have this. This is a transparent exercise. This is in the hands of the citizen to decide what they want their democracy to look like.
Yeah, exactly. What's the NDP's position on the referendum, and specifically, do you favor or support one particular system of the three that are on the ballot?
Well, we're very much in favor of moving towards proportional representation for a whole host of reasons. And we talked about some of them, you know, the ability to engage more voters, reinvigorate our democracy, have a much more functional parliament, all of those benefits that would flow from a new voting system. So on question one, where we say vote yes, the three systems on offer are all viable. They're all different means of providing a proportional representation voting system that is a common feature through so many advanced democracies throughout the world. And so, I mean, the campaign really is about trying to get people out to vote, to think about their democracy, to think ahead. And again, I think to keep the benefits of the first past the post local representative system that we have now and add the additional benefit of a second vote, to have a parliament that's more reflective of the actual wishes of voters in every region of British Columbia.
So the NDP does not have a specific preference, or?
We don't have a favorite horse in the race, but we want to see British Columbians have an opportunity to change and shape their voting system. Exactly.
Okay. And maybe just to drill down a little bit more, in terms of who gets to select the elected representatives. I mean, the no side has been talking about party favorites being elected. So if you could maybe comment on that sort of challenge, and also the issue of closed lists and open lists.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the no side is a little reluctant to admit this, but parties have nominations under the current voting system. Party members control who their candidates are. The public gets to vote for who their local representative is, but it's after political parties have played that function. So this idea to create a sharp distinction between the current voting system on this issue around party selection of candidates and a new system, there really isn't much of one. And I think that, you know, I know that Mr. Wilkinson has made a big deal about how it's horrible that British Columbia might join the mainstream of parliamentary democracies around the world by even considering proportional representation. And I know that the opponents of this referendum have tried to use the court system to stop British Columbians from even having a vote. And they're making all kinds of arguments that they should be able to spend unlimited money, that corporate money should be a feature in BC politics again. That is really, really out of step where I think British Columbians are. And I would add, in the case of Mr. Wilkinson, if he really believes that first past the post should be completely unamended and never altered, why did his party, when they selected him as leader, not use first past the post? If they had, Diane Watts would be the leader of the BC Liberal Party, not him.
Right. Very good point. And the issue of closed and open lists, because that is something that I know people who are out there doing the educational work around pro-rep are being questioned on.
Yeah. Well, I favor voters having the maximum control and choice over who their local representatives are. So, you know, I think that's an important principle that should be in any new voting system. And you know, and I think there's improvements that could have been made or long overdue under the current system. And this gives us an opportunity to just modernize democracy in so many ways. And it comes after a time where we have cleaned up big money in BC politics. I think it's now time to look at how we make Parliament itself more responsive and more reflective of British Columbia's diverse regions and you know, the perspectives that we have out there, have in our province.
So you'd support open lists?
I think that's the better way to go. I think anything that maximizes the voters' choice and transparency about who they want elected and who they want to represent them is a good thing.
Good.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned some of the fears, some of the myths that others are raising. Why do you think there's so much concern about the idea of electoral reform or modernizing the way British Columbians should be able to vote? There's a lot of rhetoric out there, as you know, and that's part of the day-to-day of politics. You're very familiar with that. But on this particular issue, which is focused on fundamental reform, empowering citizens, making our legislature more responsive, why so much resistance, reluctance, and rhetoric on opposing any idea of a reform?
Well, I think the status quo, quite frankly, has worked very well for a small, wealthy, powerful elite in British Columbia that has exercised undue influence over politics for a long time. We've changed some of those laws to address that. You know, we've reined in lobbying, we've cleaned up big money out of politics. But if you look at the history of electoral results, there's been way too many governments. Well, there's only been one occasion in BC history where a party got actually over 50% of the votes. Right. And so we've always had you know, governments that typically represent maybe 4 in 10 voters' wishes having 100% of the power again. And often that has been of parties that serve you know, small, narrow interests. So I think they want to stop change that way. But look, there's some people that they like politics being ugly. They like politics being noisy and unproductive. You know, I think most people do not. Yeah. But for some people, you know, the more we start to emulate the kind of ugliness we see in U.S. politics, that's just fine with them. I think British Columbians reject that, and I think if we want to prevent that from emerging as a feature in our democracy, we should look at a voting system that discourages it, that looks at principled compromises, stable governments that can coalesce and govern the province well and move us into the future. You know, we have to have more and more intelligent discussions, stronger and stronger consensus to be able to position our province, to remain a strong economy, to you know, be a province that's committed to values around social equity and opportunity. And I think changing the voting system will reflect that actual consensus that I think is out there amongst British Columbians. Right.
Yeah. I was honored, I guess, a year and a half ago to interview John Horgan before he was the Premier. Rick Hapgood and I had a nice session with him on electoral reform, and he promised then, he said, you know, if he was elected, he would introduce a referendum and would support proportional representation, and I'm delighted to see he's still saying that, unlike other politicians that we remember. And so I wanted you to comment on how you see the Premier's role in the process of the referendum and the campaign itself.
Well, I think people are, you know, it's refreshing to have a political leader like John Horgan make a promise and keep it, as he's done on so many occasions, and as this referendum is proof on this particular issue. I think Mr. Horgan is passionate about this as a private citizen. I mean, we do wear different hats, even though we are elected officials ourselves. So, but I know John is not looking at this, you know, in terms of his own role as an MLA. I think he's looking at this as what kind of legacy would we like to leave as the political leaders of now, but for citizens of the future to be able to have a better government in BC. So I think he takes the long view on this, and he certainly supports giving, you know, trusting the people to decide, you know, something as sacred as what kind of voting system they'd like to have, and that societies change and evolve, and democracy has to be continually improved and strengthened. And if you don't have a conversation about the essence of your democracy, then it gets taken for granted, and then it has, you know, waning interest. And that's, I think this is a real chance to reinvigorate. It's a generational opportunity to do something that will strengthen what we have built over time, with an eye to what we could do better in the future.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being here today with us. We've really appreciated your time and your thoughtful comments, Rod. And on behalf of Terry and I, thank you. And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'd like to urge people to continue the conversation and to vote. Hopefully you've received your mail-in ballot from Elections BC. If you have any questions about how to vote, you can contact Elections BC, their local offices, or go to their website, and we'll be providing that information on the show. And again, consider voting for change, and thank you for watching our show today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that was great. I
Great.
really enjoyed that.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks, Mark.
thanks very much.
Thank you very much.